All right.
Welcome. Just briefly, I'm Courtney from the library. Thank you for coming out to the town building. We are very excited to have Ted Reinstein back with us this evening. If you're joining us on Zoom, please put your questions in the chat and I'll raise my hand and read them out loud anytime.
Everyone who's here in person can have two questions. Should I use the mic in terms of the Zoom?
The Zoom is fine if it's just for the folks in this room, the microphone, yeah.
Okay.
So you don't.
You probably don't need it, right? Anybody want me to try with it? No. Good?
We're good.
Yeah.
Okay,
Very good.
all right. So, no, I mean it. Thank you very much for coming out. It's, well, today was actually a pretty nice day.
Yeah.
Still, it's early in March and, obviously it's more comfortable to stay home. So I do appreciate, those who came out in person, and hello to those who are home. So I'm going to talk to you about my most recent book, which was released this past summer. And this is a book that is all about the most memorable people that I've met in all of my travels around New England for going on 30 years of reporting. People I've been all north of the northernmost to up in the county to the furthest south you can get, and everything in between, more than once. So, but these are the most memorable people that I've met, and these are their stories. And I think you'll see why that not only their stories have impacted me, but these people have stayed with me. Literally, everybody that I'm sharing with you tonight, there are some folks here who you'd have to read the book to find out more about, but you get the idea that, or you will when I get this to work, they're there, that these people are people whose stories not only deeply impressed me to begin with, but who have impressed me and stayed with me as friends. And that does not happen with every story. I've done hundreds and hundreds of stories over almost 30 years. And this represents about 14 or 15 people, all of whom have become personal friends of mine. And that's why I was moved to write a book about them. If you're at all familiar with my traveling and reporting for Chronicle, and if you're not, I'll tell you anyway, that diners are a big part of my stories. And people always say, oh, well, you must know where to get the best breakfast. No, yeah. I mean, I love a good breakfast as much as anyone. But the funny thing is that I never go into within the stories themselves for the most part. It's not the food that draws me to diners. It's what diners represent. It's the same reason that I love visiting general stores and why I've written an entire book about general stores. It's the same reason I love public libraries, although Courtney is the only representation of the Wayland Public Library here tonight. However, it's the same thing, right? So there's nothing that you can buy in a general store that you can't buy somewhere else, generally cheaper, to be perfectly honest. So it's not the food. It's not what they sell in a general store. It's not the books in a library. It's the fact that all of these places represent community gathering places. That's why I love them. That's why I consider myself a strong ally and supporter of these places, because they're always threatened, if not financially, just in terms of being eclipsed by whether you were in, big box stores or big franchises that sell, used to sell 20-cent burgers, but I'm dating myself. So all of these people you'll see in their way have a connection with that sort of same feeling of supporting these community gathering places. The full title of the book is Travels Through the Heart and Soul of New England, Stories of Struggle, Resilience, and Triumph. So I'm separating this talk into those three areas, starting with struggle. And I'll give you a few examples of some stories that go with something like struggle. Sometimes the struggle can be about something really big. And sometimes struggle can be about something very small. You lose your car keys. That's a struggle. That's an intense struggle for the next however long it takes you until you locate your car keys, especially if the motor's running. But sometimes it's about something small like that, and sometimes it's about really bigger things. And the big thing that I have focused on for many years, I have done more than a dozen. I've done about 12 or 15 stories over the years about the struggle in Gloucester, Massachusetts, America's oldest, America's most storied seaport, the struggle to hold on to an entire way of life. An entire way of life, which I know I don't have to tell you, has been threatened significantly over the last 50 years. That's been the period when the federal government put in place plans to try to arrest the decline of first the cod fishery, and then that grew to include other species. All well-intentioned. In fact, I'm not even commenting on whether or not this has been a success, a failure, something in between. The truth of the matter is it's not definitive even now. So it's beyond my pay grade. But what we do know is how the rules and regulations have affected fishing families in Gloucester. And we do know, without all the data, that has been a tremendous loss of a way of life. It's been said that in and around 1900, the number of family-owned fishing boats like these in Gloucester Harbor numbered about 2,500 estimated. 1971, it's estimated that that number was down to about 1,200, right? So half. The last time we have a census of fishing boats owned by family members, not corporate boats. The majority of boats today in Gloucester are what they call corporate boats. They're owned by individual investors, sometimes consortium of investors that may have multiple boats. The last time we have a number for that is 2023, so just 2 years ago. And it's the only number that's not an estimate. It's definitive. And that number was down to 71 boats. So it is disappearing. It is disappearing. That goes without saying. It's driven good people like my friend Joe Sanfilippo, who I just saw last week up in Essex. It's driven people like Joe from doing what he'd done all his life, doing what his family through 4 generations did throughout their lives, which is fish. He learned to fish when he was 12 years old. He was fishing commercially with his older brother when he was 14. They learned to fish from their dad. The dad learned to fish from their grandfather. The grandfather learned to fish from their great-grandfather. And so it went. So it went for all Gloucester families. That Joe calls the pipeline of fishing knowledge, passed down through generations. That pipeline, as you can tell, is now down to a trickle of information, of knowledge getting through. And soon it may, in fact, dry up and be gone. And then the question presents itself, how will people know how to fish? It sounds like a silly question. It's not. You can replace the boats. The boats are replaceable. You can't replace the pipeline of family fishing knowledge. When that's gone, it's gone. Will people know how to fish? Of course, some people know how to fish. They're fishing now, these commercial boats. They're fishing now, but you won't have families owning boats and fishing once that knowledge is entirely gone. And Joe Sanfilippo is actually doing something about it. So this is his response to a struggle, right? The struggle to preserve this way of life. And his response is something that is unique, as far as I know, in the country. What he's doing is recognizing that people may not know how to fish, so someone needs to teach people how to fish. If you want to learn how to fish commercially, there's only 2 ways to do that. You can basically apprentice, you can get hooked on with a commercial boat, or you can have someone close to you teach you how to fish, like an apprentice. You can't go to a local community college anywhere and take a class in Fishing 101. You can't go on Amazon, although they sell a lot of books, and you cannot go on Amazon and buy Fishing for Dummies. So you have to be taught how to fish, and that's what Joe is doing. So during the day, he's captain of the Boatport, which is a cruise boat out of Gloucester Harbor. And at night, he has rented a warehouse space, and he teaches people, non-fishing people, how to fish. His students are older, they're younger, they're men, they're women. Not a single one of them owns a commercial fishing license. Not a single one of them owns a commercial boat. I don't think any one of them will be fishing anytime soon. But the idea is you're teaching people how to fish, should the opportunity become more widespread once again. And whether or not that works or not, I don't know. People have called this, what he's doing, quixotic. People have called it idiotic. People have called it a waste of time. It might be all of those things. But what it is for sure is a response to a struggle. And I really admire that. And there is Joe teaching a student. I got you, the fisherman mending a net, which these guys can do in their sleep. Joe Sanfilippo, like all Gloucester kids, learned how to mend a fishing net when he was 6 years old. And now that he's 56, he's teaching people how to mend a net. So sometimes, as we said, the struggle is small. Sometimes the struggle doesn't extend beyond a single individual. And that's certainly the case with my friend Louis Escobar, the late, wonderful Louis Escobar. Louis was a rarity of rarities, right? He was a farmer in Rhode Island, where there were not a lot of farms because Rhode Island is very small, and he was a dairy farmer in Rhode Island. That takes room. That takes land. You have to graze a herd of cows, right? You need some room for that, right? And he did. He had a wonderful, through multiple generations, again, through many generations, I think 3, maybe 4, even in Portsmouth, Rhode Island. So the northernmost top of Aquidneck Island that sticks down into Narragansett Bay, and he had this wonderful dairy farm. He did very well. He was able to create this wonderful dairy cooperative with him and the other 2 dairy farms in Rhode Island. And it did very well until about 21 years ago when Louis had a terrible accident on the farm. His tractor fell on him. And if you are lucky enough to survive a tractor falling on you, you're going to be badly injured. And he was. He was left a quadriplegic, and yet he never considered giving up the farm. Never even considered it. In fact, he got himself tricked out with this powerful electric wheelchair with these thick, fat bike tires, and said that he felt more productive. He told me he felt more productive after the accident than he did before, which I found incredible. But he swore it was true because he had to plan more, and he said he wasn't a planner, never planned before, and he did now. And who's going to argue with Louis Escobar in a wheelchair or not? Sometimes the struggle, as any journalist will tell you, is simply about getting the story out. And when you are fortunate as a journalist like I am, that I work for, a large media platform owned by a multinational corporation, I'd never had to worry about knowing whether or not I could get the story out. The worry is where you want it to be, which is getting good stories out. But for somebody like Jerry Ann Boggess, who comes across a wonderful, amazing story that she knows with good reason people would be interested to hear about, how do you get that out? Wasn't with any big media platform, wasn't a journalist, although she has all the wonderful tools of a great journalist. She's wonderful work ethic. She just first tool, most important tool of all. She's very curious. She is creative. She's a great writer. She's a great investigator. She asks a lot of questions. And she also represents sort of the embodiment of the immigrant experience in America. She immigrated from Jamaica in the early 1970s with her 2 young boys, and they settled in southern New Hampshire in the little town of Milford. And she raised her 2 kids. They went on to go to school in New Hampshire, and she found a project for herself when she settled in Little Milford, New Hampshire, which is about 12 miles west of Nashua, that she gave herself a project that she knew would help her acclimate to her new culture, her new country, her new state, her new language. And she decided what she was going to do was she was going to investigate whether or not there had ever been anybody in Milford, New Hampshire who looked like her, because there wasn't anybody when she moved there. So she said, I'm going to see if there was ever anybody. It's an interesting research project. And she made a find that was actually a significant newsmaking find. So she then, after she had done that, she decided to broaden that project to the whole state. Where were there pockets of African-American history making in New Hampshire? And she was able to do that and create in doing that what she does today. She is the co-founder of the Black Heritage Trail of New Hampshire. Today, she's the executive director, and she has found and ferreted out history that not only most people are unaware of, even in New Hampshire, even in a place like Portsmouth, they may not want to necessarily know, but it's been embraced as important education nonetheless. The fact that, for instance, in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, in the early 19th century, there were slave auctions right there on the waterfront. So what was the historic find she made? Harriet E. Wilson. Harriet E. Wilson, unlike Jerry Ann Boggess, was a native of Milford, New Hampshire, born there, born there. She, her early story reads like something out of Dickens, born to a young Black family that simply could not afford another mouth to feed. They wrapped up this young girl in blankets and put her in a big wicker basket and left her on the front porch of a wealthy white family in Milford, who took her in. She became the family's indentured servant. Very bright young woman, voracious reader, loved to write, kept journals. And in 1859, Harriet E. Wilson became the first Black novelist to have a book published in North America. And that was historically significant. And in 2006, inexhaustible as ever, Jerry Ann Boggess succeeded in persuading the town of Milford to create this memorial to Harriet E. Wilson. So our first diner, anybody ever been to the Windsor Diner in Windsor, Vermont? Talk about a rarity of rarities. Teresa Rhodes, who owns the diner, is that rarity of rarities. First of all, she is a woman who owns and runs her diner outright. No man involved. She didn't inherit it from anyone. She doesn't run it with anyone. In fact, she runs it all by herself, which is the second rarity part. I do know of other women who own diners outright. They're more rare than men, but what else is new? But she runs it by herself. Like, you look at that picture, there's no one else in the background anywhere. There's no one else in that picture. There's no one else in that diner who was employed that morning when I came in. And I was watching her. I said, what do you mean? When you say, I think 3 times, I said, Teresa, just so I have this right. When you say you run it all by yourself, you mean you have no help here today? She said, do you see anybody? I said, I don't know. Maybe they're hiding in the back. She said, no, it's all by myself. So I'm watching her work. I'm trying to figure out what the trick was, because it wasn't devolving into chaos. She was handing out menus. She was cashing people out. She was doing everything. She's cooking the food, pouring the coffee. No, she had people come over to her for everything, unless she did expertly toss something in the air. And I thought, what is the trick? And I said to her at one point, I said, I was sitting over on that at the end of the counter there, and I said, Teresa, this is driving me crazy. I said, one question. I said, I know you're busy, you don't have to look at me even, but just if you can entertain this question while you're working. I said, what is the trick? What is your trick? How are you doing this by yourself? She said, have you seen me move from this spot? I said, no, I don't think I have. She said, that's the trick. And she stood away for a minute and she pointed at the floor. She had 2 white footmarks painted on. So she had found the perfect place where she could reach everything she needed to reach. The menus, the cash register, the coffee, the grill, everything she needed. But I said, how do you serve people? She said, watch. She finished plating this guy. I think it was a plate. It was like an omelet. She got the home fries on there. She spun around. So though all people sitting at the stool all the way down this side, she spun around. This guy was sitting at the end of this side of the counter, and she said, arms up. And everyone went like this, like a Frisbee, like something out of a cartoon, you know, along the counter. She said she sprays the counter with Pam. It was unbelievable. I've never seen anything like it. I've never met anybody like that customer right there either. Billy and I, Billy, long-time customer of the Windsor Diner, although there was a big break from when he used to come in as a kid, about 50 years, to when he was back there now. He was about 83. He'd come back closer, moved back to be closer to his daughter. he was doing some house painting, and when he was a little boy, he told me he used to come in the diner. His mom was a server at the diner, and he used to come in. He used to sit right there in that stool, and he said after school, and he put his book bag down right here, sit in the stool, and he'd start his homework sitting there, and then his mom would bring him a slice of pie and a glass of milk. I can't believe Norman Rockwell never painted this. Is that right? And he's telling me this, and finally I said, whoa. I said, Billy, time out. I said, this is your stool, right? That was your stool? He said, that was it. I said, you want to tell me why you're not sitting in your stool? That is your stool. I mean, that's your stool. If the diner goes away overnight, they're gonna have to bronze the stool and stick it out on the sidewalk with a plaque with your name on it. How come you're not sitting in your stool? He said, oh, it's a good question. He said, so I moved away for about 50 years. And when I came back a few years ago, I was so happy to see that the diner was still open, running. And I came over as soon as I put my bags down at my daughter's. That was the first thing I did. I walked over here, I walked in, and there was my stool sitting right there. And he said, I walked up and I was just about to sit down. And he said, then I thought to myself, Billy, maybe it's time you graduated to the next stool. And he did. And he did. So resilience is next. Resilience. You know, I think that resilience, I really do. I think resilience is one of those qualities that's part of New England's DNA. I do. There's a lot that we have to put up with in New England that you don't have to put up with everywhere. For instance, just the weather alone, the weather, right? You do not have to be weather resilient in San Diego, okay? But you do here. The one example I use in the book that is not a person, although we'll see, there's a person here too, but the one example I use that's not a person of resilience of any of these qualities in the book is New England's mill towns, because they have always struck me as sort of the quintessence of resilience, right? Because these cities and towns like Biddeford, Maine have been there forever, hundreds of years, centuries. Many of these mill towns like Biddeford, like Lawrence, Lewiston, Haverhill, you name it, got their start in the mid-1700s. So it's literally centuries that they have stood there. Now, granted, much of the last century and a half almost, but certainly much of the last century, they stood there, these mill towns, especially these mill buildings, these mill complexes, they stood there abandoned, dark, not making money for the town, nor were they providing jobs for the people who lived there. And that had been the case for 75 years, right? Ever since the 60s, easily, and in some cases longer. They all had the same history. They all had a period of origins in the 18th century. By the 19th century, they were prosperous. Many of these towns had full employment because of the mills. And then by the 60s, 50s, 60s, certainly 70s, they're gone. They're gone first because the mill companies, whatever they produced, sought cheaper labor in the American South. And then they ditched the American South and sought cheaper labor overseas. But the mill buildings, the mill towns couldn't leave. So they turned dark, abandoned, and it was a tough time. But places like Biddeford, extremely tough times, tough years. The mid-70s, all through the 80s, in many of these towns, whether you're talking Lewiston, Haverhill, Biddeford, just brutal times. Tax base shot. Sometimes 25, in some towns like Biddeford, the unemployment rate was 26%. That's higher than the national average during the Great Depression. That's how bad it was. But by the 90s, as we know, finally, the tide turned. The national economy suddenly was doing better than it had in decades. And certainly since the mill companies left. It was also a period like a perfect storm in a positive way, where there were companies and new kinds of industries that were looking for just this kind of setup with these large mill complexes with huge square footage, like biotech companies, perfect example. And they found these mill towns which was great. And employment shot up again. And they were able to create these wonderful public-private partnerships and multi-use developments with residential, commercial, in Biddeford, Lawrence, Lowell, all of them. So now they were repeating a positive story that they all shared the same basic elements. And as I said, there's always a person. There's a person in every story, and there's always a person. That's what the mill buildings looked like once they were completely restored in Biddeford, thanks to somebody like Alan Cassavant. Alan was fourth generation French Canadian kid, grew up in Biddeford. All of his family through him. Summers when he was in high school, he worked in the mills too. All of his family did. Never thought that he would become the longest serving mayor in Biddeford's history. He had been a high school math teacher, track coach, was persuaded to run for mayor, and he really wanted to see if he could help along. The timing couldn't have been more perfect. It was right around the mid-90s when there was a chance for Biddeford to take advantage of this national movement of repurposing mill towns, and he got involved. And he was able to shepherd that kind of growth in Biddeford, the kind of growth that has been really so dramatic in Biddeford that many people in Biddeford and Maine today call it the Biddescence, in terms of what has happened in Biddeford, where these mills have been repurposed and reinvented and reimagined, and where these wonderful buildings have been brought back because the whole downtown has been resuscitated, not just the mill complexes. Like they brought back the City Theater, which is one of those wonderful, very, very iconic kind of New England building. You can find one in almost every town. I saw two. There are two right here in Wayland. Those are these, generally, this building is not, but generally these municipal buildings that were built in the late 19th century. And they would often have municipal uses in them, like it might be the town clerk, it might be the city hall, it might be the public library, it might be all three, but there would also always be some sort of a community gathering room, a place where you could have maybe a big dance, you could have a potluck dinner, you could have lectures. Charles Dickens lectured once at the City Theater in Biddeford in the 1840s. And my friend Tim Sample had the distinction, if you can call it that, of being the last band to play at the City Theater, right? So in the 60s and 70s, they were trying to, stay alive by booking, rock bands. And he was the last band to play in the City Theater. Indeed, less than a year after his band played there, the city condemned the building. So he was definitely it, and he could not get over how the building had been restored. The Palace Diner, my favorite type of diner, which is a diner that has been closed and reopened. That's my favorite kind of diner. And it was brought back thanks to Alan Cassavant, who persuaded Greg Mitchell and Chad Conley, who were two really quite up and rising chefs in Portland, Maine, to come to Biddeford and reopen this diner that had been closed for 5 or 6 years. And they did. And today the Palace is again the gem and the gathering place in the community that it always was. And sometimes you run into resilience where you don't even expect to find it. Like at a little community ski hill, where I really didn't expect to find it at all. I'll tell you when we're done with this little story about Northeast Slopes, there was a bit of a real revelation for me in East Corinth, Vermont. East Corinth is in Orange County, Vermont, which I always say is the only Orange County in America that has nothing in common with the other two famous orange counties, because it doesn't have any palm trees and it doesn't have money. And while Vermont has pockets of real affluence, what I always like to point out to people is that Vermont also has pockets of real crushing poverty. And the thing that is surprising about Vermont, and I always feel like I like to drive the point home, because a lot of people don't know. People elsewhere in New England, we go to Vermont, we might go to ski, we might go to leaf peep, we might go because we like to get maple syrup, and all of that's great. I do the same thing. That's great. What most people never realize is there is poverty in Vermont that is the same poverty you'd find in Appalachia, the same poverty you'd find in the hollows of West Virginia. You'll find it in Vermont. I've seen it. I know people who live in that poverty. And this is one of those places, which makes this story doubly remarkable, because what the hell would a ski hill be doing in the middle of that kind of poverty? It makes no sense. It makes no sense. Skiing has become prohibitively expensive. And I say that as somebody who has skied since I was 5 years old. One of my greatest joys in life is skiing. I feel very lucky that I've been able to pass that love for skiing to my two daughters, and even luckier that I get to ski with them. Once or twice a year, I skied with my older daughter just this past weekend in New Hampshire. But when I say I feel lucky that I can do that, I don't mean lucky that our schedules can mesh on occasion. That's got nothing to do with it. I mean lucky because I can afford to. I can afford to go skiing once or twice a year. And most people can't. 88% of Americans in a poll said that they don't ski, they would ski if it was more affordable. So again, what is this ski hill doing? Well, the ski hill has been there for a long time. The ski hill has been here since the 1930s. In fact, that humble little rope tow in that picture in the 1930s is still running today, and today is the longest continuously operating rope tow in North America. But I digress, because the ski hill was there since the 30s, but the ski hill closed for a long period of time in the late 1960s. Then a group wanted to reopen the ski hill. This kicked off a really intense discussion, debate about how do we do that? Because at this point, in the early 80s, it was understood that most people in this area, not everyone, but a lot of people in this area, a lot of people who lived and called East Corinth home would not be able to afford to ski. And I don't mean to shell out the $250 of an obscenity that Killington charges on a weekend now. And by the way, that'll go up next year. Why not? A ski area in Colorado is charging over $300 now. So they wouldn't be able to ski if it was $5. If you were really genuinely concerned, I don't mean what to have for dinner. I mean whether you can have a hot meal 5 or 6 nights a week. You're not going to pay $5 to ski. Never mind the hundreds or thousands more if you have multiple kids for equipment. So how to get around that problem is what they wrestled with. And finally, it fell to my great good friend, Wade Pearson, whose dad was one of the people spearheading opening it up today. And Wade has carried on the legacy as chief volunteer. And volunteer is the operative word, because nobody makes a dime at Northeast Slopes. A dime. They decided they would be a nonprofit, making them one of 3 nonprofit ski areas in the country. No one pays a dime to ski if they cannot afford to pay a dime. If you can afford to pay more, you are absolutely encouraged to contribute whatever you can. They do fundraising. And by the way, there's no stigma, because nobody knows who's paying and who isn't. There's no stigma. And if you need ski equipment, and who doesn't? If you need ski equipment, the ski bus pulls up. And the ski bus is the result of Wade's cajoling every single major ski shop in Vermont to donate last year's or the year before's equipment to the ski bus. And it's full of ski equipment that are given out for free to these kids. That's his whole driving passion, that we are in Vermont and every kid should get to ski. Damn it. And it carried the day. There he is. There's the rope tow. When I first made my first trip there, about, believe it or not, it was a month before COVID cracked down. So it was January 2020. And I'm looking at this rope tow, and I brought my skis naturally because I want to check out this wonderful little hill. And I'm looking at this rope, and it is going faster than any. There aren't a lot of rope tows left. Not a lot of people have them anymore. Not a lot of people like to ride them, and they're tricky, right? You gotta kind of know the trick. And I'm watching this thing, and I said to my photographer, I said, Bob, check this out. It was going so fast, the rope through the, because it's on the ground. It was going so fast, the friction had made like a 2-foot trough in the snow that I was going to have to reach down into to get the rope to begin with. So I said to Wade, Wade, what do you have running this thing? He's got the little shed there that I can hear it's good, the engine's going. I said, what do you have running this? A Pratt & Whitney jet engine? This is incredible. He said, no. He said, come, take a look. It's not exactly a jet engine. but it is a 73 Dodge Dart with a slant 6 engine, and he obsesses over it, and that thing is still running the rope jump. So the question is, how much did I spend for a day of skiing? Would have been last weekend if my daughter and I had gone to Killington instead of Pat's Peak. If we had gone to Killington, it would have cost me $285 for the day. And that's not even as expensive as some places in Colorado. But it didn't cost me that, my first trip to one of these slopes. I didn't break 20 bucks. Well, I did only because I wanted to donate, but I wouldn't have broke 20 bucks. Because I paid $10.50 for a lift ticket and another $6 for a delicious Norista burger. But the point is, as I said at the beginning, this was a revelation, because not only did it renew my faith in skiing for a day, but it also renewed my faith in that sense of community that we talked about right at the beginning, because this was the first community gathering place that I'd ever been to that was a ski hill. That had never even occurred to me before. And I also think, as long as we're finishing up on resilience, I often think that humor is very important when it comes to being resilient. It becomes a cliche, oh, you got to laugh your way through, as long as you can smile, humor is the best medicine, blah, blah, blah. Look, we all know there are some days that you can't laugh, you can't smile, you don't want to hear a joke, and that's the way it is. Nonetheless, my friend Becky Rule would try to get you to laugh. I'm surprised nobody's ever slugged her, because frankly, she does not let up in trying to get somebody to laugh. She's a wonderful writer, a wonderful humorist. She does a lot of talks herself. I love her last book is called Heading for the Rhubarb. And it's wonderful. It's a wonderful glossary of like outdated New Englandisms, right? Like heading for the rhubarb, right? So I didn't know that maybe some of you are horse people. I'm not. I didn't know, for instance, that rhubarb is notoriously bad for a horse. Like, it won't kill him, it'll make him really, really sick. So if you had a horse in your yard, and your horse is outside the barn, and they were going to start tending down the yard toward the rhubarb, you better get those horses back fast, right? So over time, naturally, fewer and fewer people had horses hanging around their yard. But the phrase stuck. But the phrase was sort of then used to refer to anybody who's heading for trouble of any kind. So I love the example she uses in her book. She said, well, you might have like two old friends sitting around the general store. They're sitting out on the front porch one morning, nice little summer morning, and they're drinking their coffee. And they see another friend of theirs walking up the street. And he's walking up the street arm in arm with his new lady friend. And one guy says to the other guy on the porch, I'm going to tell you something right now. He is heading for the rhubarb with that one. Okay? Heading for the rhubarb. So you want to try your hand at a New Englandism? This one apparently is still used because Becky, I could not figure this one out. I'm looking at the word Adelphia on the page. I said, is it a place like Philadelphia? I said, well, I don't get it. I said, use it in a sentence. She said, fine. She said, just yesterday. She said, I needed a few things. I jumped in the car. I drove next door to Barrington to Caleb's General Store, wonderful general store. She said, I picked up a few things. I brought my little basket up to the front counter. I put the counter down. I put the basket down on the counter. And Tina at the counter says to me, all right, hon, Adelphia? You get it. I didn't get it. So I didn't realize there was an intelligence test in the book as well. So lastly, a couple of quick examples of triumph. These are two of my favorite people in New England, and two of my most memorable stories. When you're talking about triumph or succeeding, and frequently, they talk about another cliche. There's that old cliche that sometimes you have to really hit rock bottom before you can succeed and make your way up. And that may be true. It may be true in different facets of life. It might be true in business. It's not generally true when you're talking about drug abuse, because if you fail, right, if you fail at drug abuse, you're generally dead. Okay, so, and that's where it was headed for Larson Ojala. He used to climb mountains, and then he was climbing his way into a dark, hellish ditch that was going to make him a statistic if he wasn't one of the very lucky ones who decided he wanted to arrest his fall. And he did. He grew up in the shadow of Mount Monadnock. He grew up in Jaffrey, New Hampshire. I'll be up there next week. He grew up in Fitzwilliam, Fitzwilliam in Jaffrey next door are the two towns straddled by Mount Monadnock. And Larson, when he was a little kid, after school, he used to run up and down Mount Monadnock before dinner. Like literally not stopping, not hiking, run up and down. And then by the time he was 12 or 13 years old, he was not running up and down Mount Monadnock. He was abusing drugs. By the time he was 16, he was abusing some serious stuff like fentanyl and heroin. And by the time he was 16, he'd already lost 3 friends to overdoses, gone, dead. And he knew he was, if not next, he was in line. And he is one of the lucky ones who decided, I am going to stop. And he did. He's very lucky. He, first of all, he's lucky that he was able to make that decision. He's very lucky that he had a very supportive family who had already been through hell and back with him and was still prepared to help him, and they did. And he had a wonderful mentor who was himself one of those extreme hikers who runs up and down mountains. And Larson decided he was going to take that as his recovery model, that he would run up and down Mount Monadnock once again. He checked himself into recovery. He shared with them, he told me he shared with them the day that he checked in, and they're showing him where his room is and what time dinner is and what he's going to be expected from him and all this stuff. And he said, listen, I want you to know my recovery model is that I'm going to run up and down Mount Monadnock. And he said, this guy looked at him, he said, I'll tell you what, champ, why don't we see if you get out of bed tomorrow and can walk your way to breakfast? And why don't you worry about running up and down a mountain later? So that was where he was at and where people regarded him. Okay. But he did it. He did it. 12 years this year, 2025, 12 years clean and sober, married, wonderful wife, great 2 little kids. They hike all over the country. And true to his word, in 2021, Larson Ojala not only ran up and down Mount Monadnock like he used to do one time as a kid, he set a world record. 17 summits in 24 hours running continuously. And then a year later, wait for it, broke his own record. 18 summits in 24 hours. And I knew he was doing that. I knew he was doing it, the 18 summits, over a period of Saturday night, early Sunday morning. But mid-morning Sunday, when I was pretty sure he was down, I texted him. And I said, congratulations, man. You are running free. And about an hour later, he texted me back and he said, thanks, Ted. Hey, next year, I'm going to do it again. You do it with me. And I laughed my head off. And I think I may have set my own, at least my own personal best record, the number of consecutive laughing emojis. So lastly, my favorite New Englander, Steve Brosnahan. Anybody here familiar with the Goodnight Lights phenomenon in Providence? You are. Anybody, have you seen it? But you know about it. Yeah. It is an extraordinary thing. An extraordinary thing. If Steve Brosnahan had like trademarked it, had some kind of ownership of it, he'd be a very wealthy man today in terms of the number of US cities that have copied it. But that's not Steve Brosnahan. He's only too happy to share with people how he went about creating it. Not someone who you would have thought might have created it. I mean, he's not a business guy. In fact, Steve likes to joke that he's the lowest paid member of the medical staff at Hasbro Children's Hospital, which is Rhode Island's premier hospital for helping kids fighting cancer and leukemia. But then when he jokes about that, I do remind him that, well, Steve, in all fairness, you're the only member of the medical staff without a medical degree. So that does, but that's no knock on him because that's not what he trained to do. He's a cartoonist. And Steve is in many ways, at least by the young patients at the hospital, the most beloved member of the medical staff. There may be others on the medical staff who save individual children's lives. Steve Rosnahan, while they are in a period of great struggle and great fear, saves their spirits. When he arrives at their door with his buckets of crayons and markers and his huge sketch pads, they know that for the next hour, they will not be pricked, they will not be prodded, there will be no procedures, there will be no test scheduled, and nobody in a white coat is going to whisper anything to their parents that makes them cry. They are going to be transported for the next hour. They will escape all the fear that's part of their day. And he is beloved for that reason. Now he's beloved for another reason, because he was determined about 7 or 8 years ago that he wanted to say a special goodbye to a young kid who was actually about to be released. So that was good. And he wanted to give him a special goodbye. He didn't know how to do it. He's in the kid's room in the afternoon. He's talking to him. He looks out the window and he realizes that the kid's room faces out right to the front of the hospital. And Steve rides his bike to the hospital every day. So he knows that at come 8:30 or so, he'll be walking his bike out the front door right below this kid's window. So he told the kid, tell you what, at 8:30 tonight, when he knew it would be dark, he said, I want you to look right out the window, right here, right down there, and you're gonna have a surprise. And sure enough, he walked out at 8:30, he unhooked his powerful bike light, and he shined it up at the kid's room, and he flashed it on and off, on and off, on and off. And he waved, and he turned to go, and to hear Steve tell it, apparently it had rained that afternoon. The point being, there were puddles all over the pavement. And you know how when it rains and there's puddles, the lights really reflect in them, right? So he said he's looking at this puddle and the light's still going on and off. So he looked at his flashlight, flashlight's off. He looked up at the kid's room. This young kid had just intuitively realized that if he flashed his room light on and off, he could say goodbye back. And that's how Goodnight Lights was born. Because Steve looked at that, he said, you know what? It was the biggest aha moment of my life. Because he said, I realized I don't have to do this just for this kid today. I could do what I just did and they could do what they do back to every kid in the hospital. And then he looked out at the city and the skyline and he said to himself, wow, what if I could convince the whole city? And he did. Not all together, not all at once, but that was the simple ask. 1 minute, just 1 minute every night, all year, 1 minute. You don't have to hire extra people. You can put a light on a timer, whatever. They didn't all get on board right away. But today, what time is it? 7:55. So in 35 minutes, if we were in Providence near Hasbro Children's and you didn't know what this was, you would say to yourself, what's going on? Like, oh, that was a blackout. Nope, now they're back on and off for 1 minute. Today in Providence, they call it the magic minute. If you were in Providence now, even though everybody didn't get on board right away, you would be hard pressed to find a major hotel downtown, a major business, a major college or university, the police department, the fire department, a restaurant, a bar, a coffee shop, the barges and the tugs on the Providence River, all of them flashing their lights now for 1 minute at 8:30. Now the kids don't stay in their own rooms. They all go up to the solarium they've created on the top of the hospital, big wraparound windows. They're all given their own flashlights to give them the sense that they are also answering the city as it says goodnight. So what I'm hearing about, I'm reading about this story again and again about 7 or 8 years ago. So I called up Steve Rosnahan. I said, Steve, I introduced myself. I said, we'd love to come down and do a story about Goodnight Lights. He said, great, we'd love to have you. We talked a little bit about the logistics, and then before I got off the phone, I said, one other thing. I said, Steve, I don't want to come down and impose myself on this and what this is. I said, that's not my thing. I said, what I'd like to do, if we can do it, is to have some kid that loves this Goodnight Lights, looks forward to it all day. And we'll experience it through this kid. I will ask them to explain it to me. I'm not going to explain it. I don't know anything about it. And so he said, well, let me see if I can find somebody. And before that day was over, he called me back. He said, I have the perfect patient for you. She's like to do it. Her parents are okay with it. And boy, did he ever have the perfect patient for him. Abby Walter. Abby was 10 years old when we met in 2018. She was 2 years younger than my youngest daughter. I couldn't imagine what her parents were going through. She had been a completely healthy kid. Now she had non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. The prognosis wasn't clear. She had just started chemo, lost her hair. And yet, the amazing thing is we were there for about 5.5 hours all that afternoon, and then it would be into the night. And of all the people that were in and out of the room, people coming by, what's going on, blah, blah, blah. The only person who never lost her smile all day long was the patient. And about 5:30, I told her we got to take a little break. And she said, well, you can't miss Goodnight Lights. I said, we're not going to miss Goodnight Lights. I said, as a matter of fact, that's why we're here. And as a matter of fact, you have a job to do, because I said, I need you to make sure you have a seat right next to you, because you're going to be like our play-by-play announcer. And she was delighted, and we were delighted. And I sat right next to her right there. That April 2018, that is actually from the Chronicle show that aired, and Abby starred showing us Goodnight Lights. And she said it was like the grand finale tonight when it was over. And I'll tell you, it was amazing. You see that smile on her face? As soon as that was over, and they were all kind of ushered back out of the room to come back to their rooms, it was like, it just dropped out of her. It just dropped out of her. And it was heartbreaking. And a year later, 1 year later, 2019, May, I think 2019, that story with Abby won an Emmy Award. And I don't say that to toot my horn. But the point was, when I found that out on a Saturday night, I was like, well, I have to share this with these people who did it. So that Sunday morning, I called Steve Reinstein, I called Abby's parents, and I asked them if they could all meet me in front of the hospital on Monday morning at 10 o'clock. And they did. And I was able to share the award with the people who actually earned it, Steve Rosnahan and Abby, who today is 16 and cancer-free. That is a triumph. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. And thank you to those at home. I mean that. Anybody have a quick question? Anybody have a question? Any questions in the chat? Courtney? Nothing yet?
Just a comment from our director who joined us. That he just said to say hi. He worked with you in Northborough and he was excited for your presentation. Chris, yeah.
It's Chris Sundquist.
Yep.
Yes. Tell him I said hi.
I will.
Is he watching right now?
I think he is, yeah.
Yes. Hello, Chris. Yes, of course. I totally forgot that. I totally forgot that. We go way back. That's great. That's great. Yes.
I should know this, but are you born, bred New Englander?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Yes, I am. How much cred would I have, really?
I know.
I've often thought about that. How could I have done this?
So-
I was. I grew up right on Boston Harbor. I grew up in Winthrop.
Yeah.
Or as I like to refer to it, the charming little seaside town at the end of runway 27.
Yeah.
No,
Yeah.
very noisy childhood.
Yeah.
But yes, yes, yes. I definitely. Anybody else? Yeah, Courtney.
Was it hard to pick a certain number of stories?
Was it hard? That's a good question. Was it hard to pick a certain number of stories? It was hard. It really was. Now, I will tell you, I picked twice as many as that ended up in the book because the publisher, midway through my writing, cut it in half.
Oh.
Yeah, so thank you very much. Thank you, thank you. They're not listening, so I can say without any reservation. But yeah, so there would have been even more.
So we need part
But it
two.
was, what's that? I
Need
need part
volume
two.
two,
Yeah, yeah, a different publisher. But it was hard though. It was, yeah, because it really, I will say this, there are many, many more wonderful stories and wonderful people in the book that I didn't share tonight. It's funny, I'm glad you asked that because today, I forget why, I was rewriting something for a blurb for a talk this summer. And anyway, and I was reminded by a few stories that I knew are not in the talk. And I was thinking, oh man, maybe I should substitute one or two tonight. There are some other wonderful ones. And one of my favorites, and this is one of the ones that I was reminded of today. The funniest name, his name is, he's just simply known in Vermont as Beefer, right? So you would spell it like Beefer, Beefer. But his actual name is James Burton Roth. Talk about an old time New Englander. Yes. But the funny thing is, so how do you get Beefer? I love this story because I asked him once, I said, why do people call you Beefer? He said, well, my name is James Burton Roth. I said, well, right, where's the Beefer? Well, my father, used to say to me every night when he came home, hello, James Beefer Burton Roth. And he said, over time, I thought I had 4 names. I thought I was James Beefer Burton Roth. So I always thought that was a riot. So anyway, the point is, why is he a great story? It's not just because of the name thing. He is was an amazing carpenter, woodworker, right? And when he dropped out of college, he and a buddy moved to Vermont from Michigan, and they were making really fairly high-end, tables and cabinets and all kinds, stuff that you would expect. And then at some point, for some reason, and I don't remember what the connection was, the Paul Newman camp, the not hole in the
Hole in the wall gang.
Thank you. The hole in the wall gang. Exactly. I knew the hole was in there somewhere. And they got in touch with them and they said, they were looking for somebody to build a treehouse for the camp. And they were like, we've never built a treehouse. But they tried, they made some prototypes and they decided, hey, this is kind of fun. And they did. And they made this amazing treehouse for the camp in Connecticut. Fast forward. They have made, their mission now is to make a treehouse in all 50 states. They made most of them in and around New England, but they do travel. They don't just make treehouse. And at some point, he said, I find this really moving. He built a treehouse for a public school. And all the kids, when it opened, were like, rushed. It was like they cut the ribbon and they all rushed across the field to the treehouse. And he said, I turned and looked. Yeah. And there was a kid in a wheelchair. And Beefer broke down in tears. And he said, I don't care if I have to carry that frigging wheelchair up into the treehouse. He's getting into the wheel. And I'm never building another treehouse that a kid like him can't get up into it. Now, do they build tree houses on commission? If you want one in your yard, yes, it won't have what they have pioneered. But what he really does now is he builds these tree houses for anybody to have the accessibility to do it. And they actually pioneered a building technique that has now been used by other companies. They created their own technique for how they could, affordably, without costing a town millions of dollars, create these accessible ramps that can fold up. They're lightweight, they're strong, and they can get up at pitches you wouldn't think by doing these, you know what I mean. Anyway, that's one of my favorite stories in the book. And gonna put that in next time. So you heard it, and now I'm gonna do it on a nightly basis. So anyway, thank you very much. Yes,
Oh,
question.
just two more questions. Is there a list of the diners that you visited somewhere?
There is a list. You will have to come to me in person to get it. I'm kidding. The list, all kidding aside, you'll only find it in the book. So I guess you'll have to buy the book. And come to me in person to get it signed. No, there's no different like separate list, but it's in the book. In my first book, New England Notebook, I also include some diners. But unfortunately, there's no, but somebody's welcome to email me. All kidding aside, I'm happy to tell them the diners are in the book. You can go on my website, which is tedreinstein.com, easiest way, and you'll be able to send me an email from there. I'd be happy to give anybody the diners. What was the other one?
Chris is wondering if you've ever skied Tuckerman's Ravine in late spring, or
Ah.
at least watched them ski from Lunch Rocks below the ridge.
Yes. Has
Where
Chris?
is that? I don't know.
So the question from Chris, the library director, was, have I ever skied Tuckerman's Ravine in late spring and watched from Tucker? It's almost like he's like, have you heard me say that before?
Maybe.
Because I have that very thing. In fact, I have a great story, very, 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 very quick. Tuckerman's Ravine, if you're not familiar with it, is just that. It is, if you look at famous Mount Washington, standing with that snow, there is a place, if you're looking at the mountain, there is a place, what would be to the left of your view, where it looks like it slopes down and it looks like a bowl. That's Tuckerman's Ravine. And that's very popular in the spring. You wouldn't be able to attempt it in the wintertime. But in the spring, as it begins to melt a little bit, the snowpack kind of hardens and packs down a little bit. It's very popular to hike up. There's no lift. So you have to hike up with your skis. And then once you get to the ravine, you hike up even further to a point that you feel comfortable. It's very steep. It's a 70-degree, so it's extremely steep. And when you get to a point that you feel like, okay, this is far enough, you put your skis on and you let go. And I did that, oh God, it's gotta be about 20 years ago now. And then, and then at lunchtime, I sat, a lot of people sit on what's called lunch rocks. So if it's a sunny day, it gets nice and warm on the rocks, people have lunch, they cheer for people. What's a little bit macabre is that, so people, the safety in coming down, obviously there's no ski patrol, and it's extremely steep and it goes up really high. You can hike up all the way up to the head wall. Most people don't. It's really brutal. It is so steep that so you have to sidestep to keep going up. And as you are getting up and up, I've never seen this before. Your uphill knee is like up about where your head is. That's how steep it is. And so most people get to a point where it's self-regulating, right? Because you get to a point you're like, oh, holy crap, I'm not going any further, right? The people eating lunch on Land Rocks, when they see somebody ready to get, they're like, further,
No.
higher. I know, it's sick. But it's funny, you talk about the Mount Washington being, infamous for weather. When I skied and hiked and skied Tuckerman's, and by the way, I always say, people say, have you ever skied Tuckerman's? Let me tell you, it's hike Tuckerman's, because it's about, 20 minutes of skiing and about 4.5, 5 hours of hiking. It was, I know exactly when it was. I don't know the year. So it's probably in 90, 91, and it was Memorial Day. So it was May, the end of May, the last day in May. And I got up to Pinkham Notch to start hiking up. It was about 11 o'clock in the morning when I got up there. It was beautiful, sunny. It was already about 62 degrees in Pinkham Notch. Started hiking up. I skied for a while. I had lunch. I may have taken another one. People were looking because it was getting very cloudy and dark. And then the word starts going around. Front's supposed to be coming through. A lot of people, everybody starts gathering up their stuff. You could feel the temperature dropping. It dropped to 39 degrees from 62 in less than an hour. it was hailing, freezing rain, and it was like people were trying to rush, and you don't want to rush because the rocks are already slippery. So yeah, so that's the Mount Washington weather. That's the Mount Washington weather. So listen, again, thank you very much. I went on too long, but I appreciate you coming out in person. And if anybody does want a book, I do have some books. So as I go over there and I'll start packing my stuff up, if anybody would like a book, I would be happy to sell you one. Thank you very much, folks.
Thank you.
Thank you.